Jerry, come on.
This morning's first lesson comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 58, verses 6 through 9. Hear the word of the Lord. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loosen the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, when you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, Here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, I've lost the last part of the verse. Am I okay? I took pictures because I didn't want my wireless to cut out, and I took the wrong pictures. God forgive me this morning for losing part of the word of the Lord. It's there somewhere still. Thanks.
That's I had you end right there.
Right.
Yep. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer, and you will cry for help, and he'll say, Here am I. Well, we've been talking about the church, what it means to be the church as a people. We've talked about it, where we are in time and place, established by Christ, empowered by his Spirit, called by God, and called to community with one another. Last week we talked about being called to worship, and that's part of what we do. We reorient ourselves to what is really ultimate when we worship together and give God the praise that's due him. Today we're talking about being called to service, to be called to be a people who serve. And we began to see some of that in what the passage Jerry read from us from Isaiah 58. And you hear some of these things. God says, this is the kind of worship. This is the type of fasting. You want to honor me? Do it like this. Care for your neighbors in these practical ways. Loose the chains of injustice. Untie the cords of the yoke. Or, in fact, even break every yoke. And set the oppressed free. He says, share your food with the hungry, provide shelter to the poor wanderer, and those who are naked, clothe them. Practical acts of service. And the Old Testament prophets repeat this refrain over and over again. You cannot honor me, you can't love me, if you're treating each other unfairly or unjustly. Part of this passage from Isaiah, and most of the Old Testament prophets actually cry out against what today we would call institutional or systemic injustices. And today in our country we have another kind of a renewed interest in, an opportunity to be attentive to those who say there's a yoke of oppression that is keeping me and my family and friends and neighbors bound. It's time to break that yoke. We need, as ones who want to honor God, we need to listen attentively to those cries. We need to think carefully about, are there ways that we organize our life together that's not fair for everyone? Those can be difficult things to hear, but we of all people, the ones who name Christ as our Lord, need to listen attentively. There are other things that are not so much about systemic injustices, simple things. Share your food with those who are hungry. Clothe those who are naked. And he ends this way. Don't turn away from your own flesh and blood. I'll come back to that a little bit later on. But now we're going to pick up with the New Testament reading. And Jesus is talking not so much about public corporate structures as acts in the intimacy of a domestic setting. Little acts of service among friends. This is a familiar passage, but it teaches a profound lesson, and one that I need to keep hearing. I think we all need to keep hearing over and over again. It comes from John 13, right in Jesus' last days. It was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God, and that he was returning to God. So he got up from the meal. He took off his outer clothing. He wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that he had wrapped around him. And when he had finished washing their feet, he put his outer clothes back on, and he returned to his place. He said, "Do you understand what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. Now if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, so you should wash one another's feet. Verily, very truly I tell you this, that no servant is greater than the master, nor is the messenger greater than the one that sent him. And now that you know these things, you're blessed if you do them." Let me make a couple observations about what's going on here. First of all, it is some of the very last hours that Jesus has with the disciples alone. He knows that the end has come. He knows that Judas is already playing out a plan to have him arrested, which will lead in his crucifixion. These are the last moments of intimacy in a safe place with the people that he's invested the last years of his life to. And he does something really dramatic. He teaches them something not just with his words, but he waits until the meal is underway. The time for entering a home and doing ritual cleansing, that's past. They're in the middle of enjoying dinner. But in the midst of that, Jesus captures their attention by getting up, assuming the role of a servant, and carefully washing their feet. He doesn't just say it, he enacts it, he embodies it. And this has got to be high on his priority of teaching list. What does he want them to know and remember when he's gone? Well, this is one of those things. He says, I'm showing you how to serve as your Lord and your Master, assuming the role of a servant. So that's really important that they know that. And secondly, I think he goes to pains to underscore this by acting it out, because it's so countercultural. In the passage I read, I skipped over a little interim piece where Peter objects. He says, whoa, Jesus, this isn't right. You're the Master and Lord. I'm your unworthy student and disciple. You should not be washing my feet. I should be washing yours. Peter knows this is countercultural. It's not the way we do it. We as humans long to hold on to positions of importance and significance, don't we? And Jesus is saying, it's not how to do it. So he, I think, is at pains to underscore this because it cuts against not just cultural practices, but against our ego and our sense of our own importance and significance in this world. And thirdly, he just says this, now that you've seen this, now that I've demonstrated this to you, you'll be blessed if you do it. You will find happiness as you imitate me in this course. So service, what does service look like? We get a picture of service from the early church. The early followers of Jesus, first century Jerusalem, Roman Empire, gained a reputation as being countercultural folks who caused their neighbors to scratch their head and wonder what was going on because they had this practice of rescuing orphans. Now, in the Greco-Roman world, in first century Palestine that was under Roman control at the time, it was both legal and socially acceptable that if you had a child that you didn't like and a baby born that you didn't want, maybe there was a deformity, maybe you were hoping for a boy but got a girl, maybe it was just an inconvenient time, you could leave that child on the rubbish heap to be exposed to the elements and the wild dogs to be done with. It was just the way you did things. It's costly to raise a child. Why would you go to the expense and effort to take care of a child that you didn't want? Well, common knowledge said, it's too bad. Try again later, maybe, but throw this one out. The Christians of the day had a practice of bringing in those orphans, rescuing those ones. And their neighbors would say, why would you care about a child that's not your own, who is an expense and a drain on you? And the Christians just simply answered, because we're called to love. They served. What a beautiful example. The church began with a reputation of being the ones who radically loved others, even the most unwanted. It's pretty wild, isn't it? Well, that type of care, I think it grows out of, it's a natural response to the acknowledgement that we really are all one. In God's big human family, we belong to one another. This is the way Isaiah said it. He said, don't turn away your own flesh and blood. Remember just a sentence before that, he said, the wanderer, the stranger who is wandering among you, don't turn away your own flesh and blood. The one that you think is other, foreign, strange, different. The wanderer, your own flesh and blood, says Isaiah. The New Testament picks it up this way. Jesus, when in Matthew 25, he's talking about what the final judgment seat will be like. Do you remember this scene of separating the sheep and the goats? And he puts his sheep over here and says, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. When I was ill, you cared for me. When I was imprisoned, you visited me. And they said, when? When did we do that? Inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Jesus is saying, you saw the connection. You did it. Or a couple weeks ago, we were talking about this image of community, of belonging to each other, belonging to a single body. In 1 Corinthians 12, it puts it this way. It says, when one member hurts, they all hurt together. When one member is honored, they all are honored together. You know, this is one of my favorite quotes from Dr. King. He said this, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. In service, I believe, is a natural outgrowth of tapping into that reality, seeing that our fates are mutually bound together, and caring for another is indirectly caring for oneself. Caring for somebody else's family member is indirectly caring for your own family members. Yeah, we can provide care in big ways, freedom from oppression, addressing systemic oppression if it exists and where it exists, but also personal needs, like Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Sometimes acts of service are not about bringing folks just to a standard of basic living, feeding them and clothing them, but it's actually helping them flourish. Those of you who are parents out there know what it's like to sacrifice for the sake of your kids, that they not are just fed and clothed, but that their potential is realized and that they flourish in the world. You know, I read this week and I was pretty amazed by this. It caught me off guard. I didn't realize it. You guys all know the name Isaac Newton, right? Sir Isaac Newton. He's one of the most influential scientists in Western culture to shape the world. You know, he was knighted by Queen Anne. He was a president of the Royal Society of London for the advancement of knowledge. His book, which came out in 1687, The Mathematical Principles of the Natural World, or Principia Mathematica in the Latin, is probably, arguably, the most influential scientific work ever. What I was astonished to learn is that it was close to not even seeing the light of day. The world was almost didn't benefit from Newton's insights. Now, somebody else might have come along later, but not when they did. And here's why. It was because of the involvement and persistence of a friend of his, a younger guy who was also a mathematician and an astronomer. His name was Edmund Halley. You might know Halley's name because his is the one tied to the comet. And he used some of Newton's laws to predict the recurrence of that comet flying around. But Halley is the one who pushed Newton to develop his ideas, to spell it out, to pursue them until he could condense his ideas into mathematical formulas. And it was Halley who corrected some of Newton's mathematical errors. It was Halley who drew some geometric figures to illustrate what Newton was doing with those mathematical formulas. And he coaxed Newton all the way through to getting this stuff in publishable form. And then he edited the work. And get this, even though Newton had a lot more money and a lot more connections and more prestige, it was Halley who paid for the publication because he believed in this thing. And then soon after its publication, Newton reaped all the fame and glory, and we know his name, right? Watch out for falling apples. We know Isaac Newton, but Halley, we might think about him once every, 70 years when the comet zooms by. Serving others is not just about simple acts of hospitality or basic human care, but about spending yourself for the sake of another that they can flourish. And just as in this case, when other people flourish, like Amanda was telling the kids, everybody benefits. We all benefit, You know, we understand acts of service in our daily life, don't we? Some of us, it's in the home, caring for each other, caring for people we love who need a lot of attention, whether they be old or young or in between. For some of us, it's through places of work, what you do to contribute to the community and how you connect with your coworkers to make that happen. Some of you, it's through volunteer work. Even this church couldn't get along without a lot of volunteers, people giving their time to help it not just stay open and afloat, but to flourish. So I wonder, as you think about your week, the week that comes ahead of you, how is it that your life is touching others in a way that gives witness to this notion that we are bound up with one another in a single garment of destiny? Think for a moment, whether it be family members or friends or neighbors, whether it be working through a place of employment that gives you a paycheck or an institution of volunteer work. Where is that? Now, there are two cautions that I think need to be added here about service. And it's because our own egos, we bring them to everything we do. And we can't get rid of those things, but by God's grace, we can help the Spirit reform us in these ways. But for some people, the call to service, it comes in a way such that it feeds into a problem they already have of kind of self-abasement. Their view of themselves, their esteem of themselves is so low, they think the only thing I'm fit for is serving somebody else's needs. You've heard the phrase being treated like a doormat, let someone walk all over you. Well, there are some for whom service is a way of being not freely and joyfully and strongly entered into, but out of a sense of low self-esteem or maybe even self-loathing. And there are some for whom this message of being a servant can even lead to their staying in abusive situations in ways that they shouldn't. If you have friends who are in that situation, pray, speak to them, help them get help. No one needs to be against their will in a place of abuse or being taken advantage of because they somehow think it's their responsibility to serve an abusive partner or boss or friend. There's a problem at the other end of the spectrum too. And some of us, it's not that we have a low self-esteem, it's that we have too high a valuation of ourselves. And we can engage in acts of service not out of a spirit of mutuality, but rather out of a sense of superiority and condensation. Caring for others becomes a way just of boosting our own egos. And we can assume or reaffirm a position of power and importance and significance by showing our magnanimity to all those poor souls beneath us. Well, that's not the kind of service Jesus was talking about. Neither attitude are what Jesus calls us to, and neither were demonstrated by what Jesus did with his disciples. It's not self-abasement nor haughty arrogance is a true service of worship. The true service of worship comes out of a position of strength and of self-knowledge and out of freedom. And freedom and knowledge that acknowledges that we do belong to each other, and that we as a people, we as a church, we as a community, we as a people flourish when we all flourish together. Let me draw your attention to a verse I read in John 13, but you may not have caught it because it came so quickly. It said this, there in the middle of the meal, in verse 3 of John 13, it says, Jesus knew that the Father had already put all things under his control. Jesus knew his position in the scheme of things. He knew who God the Father was, and he knew what his role was. And then it says this, he knew where he was from, and he knew where he was going. So he got up from the table, put on a towel, and washed the disciples' feet. Jesus' ability to serve self-sacrificially grew out of a firm knowledge of who he was, where he'd come from the Father's goodwill, and where he was going, back to the Father's eternal care, in a relationship of mutual love. That allowed Jesus to freely assume and model that position of servanthood. I think our call, the first call on our life to be able to imitate Jesus and fulfill this call to service is to be connected with God such that we know who we are, where we're from, and where we're going. And then all those concerns of ego, thinking we're not good enough or thinking that we're too good, can fall away as we assume our rightful place as members in God's body together. So let me ask you again, where this week can you take time to listen attentively to God's Spirit, calling you his own, calling you by name, assuring you of where you've come from, not an accident of history, but by his good design? And where are you going? Not just to dust and dirt, but to eternal presence with God the Creator and Christ our Lord. Ask the Spirit to anchor you and root you in that reality. And then ask again, where does my life touch others in a way that I can see and help them flourish for all of our sake? I assure you that if you ask God and pray those prayers, he will answer to attentive ears and open hearts. May that be true of us this week. Amen. Let's